Michelle for WVIP, and I have with me today Martin Hauser. He's a Lutheran minister. He's a graduate of Harvard University and the University of Edinburgh. He is the pastor at Grace and St. Paul's Church at West 71st Street in Manhattan. So I want to welcome Martin here with us today.
Hi, Mary Michelle.
Nice.
Thanks for inviting me to come and chat with you.
Good. And we're going to start a little bit talking about the liturgical year and the Christian calendar. And I thought maybe we could start with the first holiday after Christmas, or what I perceive to be the first holiday after Christmas, Candlemas.
Well, Candlemas isn't quite the first holiday after Christmas, but it is what's called in liturgical theology the quarantine of Christmas. It's the 40th day after the birth of Christ, and therefore the conclusion of the Christmas season. The story for the day is very beautiful. It's the story of how after Jesus' birth, Mary and Joseph took him to the temple on the 40th day, as the law of Moses requires in the Old Testament, and they presented in the temple the sacrifice of 2 turtle doves, which was the poor people's sacrifice. And the story goes that there was at that time in Jerusalem a man named Simeon who had the gift of prophecy. And God had told Simeon that he wouldn't die until he had seen the Messiah. So when Mary and Joseph were in the temple, the Holy Spirit told this man to go to the temple and he would see the promise of God. So he saw Mary and Joseph and the baby, and he took the baby into his arms and said, "Lord, now you let your servant go in peace. Your word has been fulfilled. My own eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of every people." And also in the temple at that time there was a prophetess. It's interesting, I think, at that time prophecy had ceased in Israel, but St. Luke, being a Gentile, didn't know that. And he was familiar with prophetesses in the Christian congregations. So he put this elderly prophetess, Anna, in the temple. And she, too, was delighted to see the Messiah of Israel. It also includes the first absolutely unequivocal prophecy of the crucifixion of Jesus. When Simeon takes the baby Jesus into his arms, he says to Mary, "This child will be for the rise and fall of many in Israel, and a sword will pierce your own soul too," looking forward to Jesus' death on the cross. I think the first record we have of any celebration for Candlemas was in the diary of Egeria. She's a wonderful woman of the 4th century, one of the rare church mothers. You often hear theologians talking about the church fathers. There were 3 or 4 church mothers, and Egeria says that they had this wonderful celebration in Jerusalem on the 40th day after the celebration of Christmas. From there it spread to Syria and to the Byzantine court at Constantinople, and from there to Rome, to the court of the Pope, and from there into Germany. The Germans were the first to come up with the idea of carrying candles in procession on Candlemas and making it kind of a festival of light.
And how does St. Bridget, the Irish patron, do you have any idea how she might fit into this?
Well, I anticipated your question because I know your interest in things Celtic from our long association. I am a German-American Lutheran, but I did have the privilege of studying at the University of Edinburgh, and I have on my mother's side some Scottish ancestry that actually came through rather strongly. So I do happen to know something about that. The legend in Scotland is that when Mary and Joseph took the baby Jesus to the temple on the 2nd of February, it was dark, so they had to have St. Bride light the way with a candle. And there's terrible winds and storms, but somehow St. Bride's candle miraculously did not go out, so she was able to get them in safety into the temple at Jerusalem.
So this idea of light and fire runs through the celebration of Candlemas.
Yeah. St. Bride's Day is, of course, the 1st of February, the day before Candlemas. We don't have St. Bride's Day in our calendar. We could if we like.
Right.
We have permission to add it. St. Bride is a Scottish and Irish saint, not really a German and Scandinavian one.
Okay, one of the principles that I wanted to talk about, in as much as we're talking about this celebration of Candlemas and the time of year that it comes about, are the 4 Celtic holidays, Halloween in vogue, which is this corresponds more or less, and Beltane and Lammas Day, Beltane being the 1st of May, Lammas Day the 1st of August. And I have a little bit of an idea that maybe you might help me with this idea that I have of the 4 Gospels and the fixed signs. Could you explain a little bit the nature of the 4 Gospels and the animals that they represent and perhaps the elements?
I will do my best on that score.
Okay.
The symbols of the 4 evangelists became at quite an early date because you find them on very ancient Celtic illuminated manuscripts. The angel for St. Matthew, for St. Luke, the ox rather, for St. Mark a lion, and for St. John the eagle. And these are also the 4 Chayot HaKodesh, they're called in Hebrew, the 4 living creatures that carry the throne of God through the universe when God travels from place to place. You find this in the 1st chapter of Ezekiel, and you find it again in the Revelation to John at the very end of the Bible, that these 4 living creatures support the throne of God. And I find them to be very appropriate for the evangelists. They are elemental symbols. The symbol of Matthew is the angel, a human figure, and also the symbol of the sign Aquarius, a fixed air sign in astrology. And the Gospel of Matthew is an extremely intellectual gospel. Matthew delights in words. Matthew delights in paradox. It's very much a gospel of the intellect and of words. Luke, on the other hand, whose symbol is the ox, corresponds to Taurus, fixed earthy sign. And Luke is the earthiest of all the Gospels. Luke is extremely literal. He has no use for metaphor at all. Everything is very literal and down to earth. And he's also the writer most concerned with the poor. In Luke's Gospel especially, Christ is always involved with the problems of the poor. Even in the little story of Candlemas, he emphasizes that the parents of Jesus are poor people, and they can only afford the poor person's sacrifice. Mark, on the other hand, his symbol is the lion, a fixed fiery symbol of the sign Leo. And Mark's gospel is absolutely breathless. Jesus never stays in one place longer than a minute. He heals, he casts out demons, and then he's off again. John's gospel, on the other hand, is the most mystical of all the gospels, and it corresponds more to the fixed water sign of Scorpio, which is occasionally represented not by the scorpion, but by the 2 extremes of serpent and eagle. And John gets the eagle extreme. As St. Augustine says, John takes us on eagle's wings to a region so bright that our earthly eyes almost are dazzled by the sight. So I think that's...
Well, now that we've brought John, the last one, the Scorpio, the eagle, could we get into the symbolism of the serpent and perhaps talk a little bit about some of the alchemical images?
We'll do our best. You know, there is some serpent imagery connected with St. Bride's Day in Scotland.
Oh, really?
There is indeed. There are charms that are recited about serpents on St. Bride's Day. And the legend is that on that day the serpents begin to come out of their nests. And hundreds of years ago the people recited charms to keep the serpents from biting. And even on occasion would symbolically crush serpents, not in reality, but symbolically.
Well, I think the thing about the serpent that appeals to people on a very simplistic level is that he sheds his skin. So it's, it's always that idea of renewing life by, the fountain of youth, which of course is an alchemical idea. Can you perhaps expand on that a little bit, how you see alchemy in the search for either the fountain of youth or the development of the soul or the development of turning lead into gold? I know.
Well, how many hours do we have here? I think what alchemy is just science with the God left in. I think modern science, or what passes for it, is one of the tragedies of the time we live in. There was a time when the theologians of my tradition were all versed in astrology and in alchemy, and occasionally even in magic. But then when the Enlightenment came along, I think no religious tradition was more devastated by secular humanism than we were. And ever since the last century, we Lutherans have been trying our best to pretend that we're on the cutting edge of culture and we're abreast of everything scientific and up to the minute. And that's really too bad, because the scientific universe is really a godless universe. What makes modern science possible is that there is no divinity in it, no deity. And that is impossible to correlate with our Lutheran Christian theological tradition.
But it was also part of your tradition to study the Old Testament and Hebrew and the Kabbalah.
Right. I think that would also be another hour.
Well, should we do
it? Let's do it. Let's do it. But first, one more thing about alchemy. Luther said that alchemy was a wonderful thing for two reasons. One, it gives us so many wonderful scientific preparations, medicines, and so forth. And the other thing is that it's a parable of Christ. In our tradition, Christ is the philosopher's stone. It's Christ that turns the lead in us into gold, the dross in us into gold. And without Christ, that is not possible. Christ is the necessity, the sine qua non for the spiritual life. So all of our people, for centuries, practiced alchemy. The first Lutheran pastor ordained in this country was Justice Faulkner, who practiced herbal medicine. He collected his herbs on astrological principles, prepared his medicine on alchemical principles. Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, the patriarch of American Lutheranism, brought with him to this country the elixir of gold, a jealously guarded secret of the Lutheran Missionary Institute at Halle in Saxony.
All right, well, I think maybe we should take a little break and come back, and we'll go on with this talk about the Kabbalah with Martin Hauser, the Lutheran pastor. Thank you. This is Mary Michelle for WVIP, and we're back with Martin Hauser, the Lutheran minister. He's a pastor at Grace and St. Paul's Church in Manhattan. And we're going to continue our conversation dealing with the nature of the Kabbalah, which interconnects with the Hebrew tradition, perhaps the Old Testament. Would you like to give us a little bit of an idea of this?
One of the primary features of the Protestant Reformation was that the Bible was, in a way, rediscovered. People started learning Hebrew and Greek once again, were able to read the scriptures in the original languages. Martin Luther taught Hebrew at the University of Wittenberg, and the grammar he used was one prepared by Johannes Reuchlin, the uncle of his closest friend, Philip Melanchthon, who was also on the faculty at the university.
I've heard you mention his name quite a few times.
My great hero.
Yeah.
Reuchlin also was one of the great Kabbalists of the Renaissance. He had gone to Italy in his youth and met Pico della Mirandola, and Pico had convinced him that you cannot know God unless you know the Hebrew language. So Reuchlin brought these ideas back to Germany with him, and Kabbalistic thinking was very much a part of the Lutheran tradition for several centuries. Again, I think it was one of the great casualties of the Enlightenment. As a result, we Lutherans are, to this day, in trouble with our theology of creation, I think. We've been forced to borrow from the Calvinists, and that doesn't work well with the rest of our sacramental theology.
Could you explain the three columns that are in the Tree of Life in the
Tree of Life is certainly part of the Kabbalah from earliest times, from times of the book Bahir, but it really comes to the fore in Lurianic Kabbalah in the 17th century. And it's basically a diagram that keys you into reality, if you will. It is sometimes divided into three pillars: the pillar of mercy, the pillar of severity, and the middle pillar, which really is a representation of the Christian faith. It leads directly from this earthly kingdom through the religion of the Old Testament to the revelation in Jesus Christ, directly to the throne of God. So even these distinctly Kabbalistic ideas fit rather nicely with our theological ideas, or at least we used to feel that way.
Right. And now they correlate too. Didn't you say one side of the tree of life correlates to one of the Gospels writers more, and then one?
Not so much the Gospels, but it's interesting that you can sort of place people's spirituality on the tree of life.
Right.
Some spirituality leads a little more toward the pillar of severity. It tends to be a little more intellectual. And then those who veer toward the pillar of mercy are a little more earth-oriented and a little bit more feeling-oriented in their spirituality.
And then the middle column?
The middle column is the balance between the two.
The toughest one.
One strives for.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to talk a little bit, too, because one of the things that I always mention when I do, whenever I work with something to do with astrology, I try to always give credence to the Hermetic philosophy and the Emerald Tablet and the words of Hermes Trismegistus. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and talk about the principle of as above, so below.
A little bit, I think. One of the things that I always thought was interesting is that the climate that produced the Lutheran Reformation was extremely hermetic, but you never find references to the Emerald Tablet or to the so-called Hermetic Corpus, the standard works of Hermes Trismegistus. But certainly that was a part of our cosmological thinking, that this earth recapitulates what goes on in heaven, and the human body recapitulates what goes on in the rest of the cosmos. I think it's, again, a tragedy that we've lost Hermetic thinking in our tradition and replaced it with watered-down science.
Right.
The Lutheran Reformation really had two foci. Luther sort of summed up in his person all of these wonderful currents of medieval mysticism, Bernard of Clairvaux, Johannes Tauler, people like that, whereas his colleague, Philip Melanchthon, was a Hermetic philosopher and involved in all things alchemical and astrological and scientific in that Renaissance sense.
There was somebody that I believe was kind of a different way of thinking than the Hermetic way of thinking. Was it Leibniz or the Royal Leibniz?
Leibniz, yeah, Leibniz was certainly one of the founders of the Enlightenment. He did for a time flirt with the dissolving remnants of the Hermetic tradition, and then finally seems to have decided to go with the new science that was emerging. He and Newton, in a way, I think are kind of pivotal figures. They're either the beginning of the beginning or the beginning of the end, depending on your point of view.
But Newton had quite a work of knowledge in alchemical and astrological...
Oh, yes, he did indeed. Newton produced an enormous volume of alchemical work, which is almost unpublished, not quite. 2 or 3 of his notebooks have been published, but most of the stuff still molders away in libraries throughout the world. Unfortunately, the collection was broken up. It was auctioned off in the 30s, and some of it was bought and kept in England, but I suppose much of it is difficult to get at these days.
What I wanted to ask you about this idea of our forefathers and the idea that they were involved with Freemasonry, but that also they came to be what is known as deists.
Our forefathers in the sense of American
forefathers. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin.
Yes. I think it's a mistake when you hear the so-called Christian right saying that this country is founded on Christian principles. Well, it wasn't. These people were deists and early Unitarians, and as you said, they were Freemasons.
And Ben Franklin tried to rewrite the Lord's Prayer, as I understand it.
I have heard this. I've not seen his version. I suspect I might not be wholeheartedly in favor of it. I don't know for sure.
But certainly Thomas Jefferson was very proud of the fact that he separated church and state. And that in itself as a principle is something that has validity. But I think that, it's too bad that you lose somehow there was a loss of a certain kind of spiritual understanding.
Well, exactly. I think especially in more recent times, when I think you and I were in school, we were allowed at least some exposure to the great religious traditions of the world. But from my children in confirmation class these days, I gather that in public school they are not exposed to any sort of spiritual heritage at all. I'm not sure that's for the good.
Well, I don't understand how you can study history.
Well, exactly.
You know, I mean, history is so much about spiritual beliefs, and I mean, all right, it may have been based in economic problems, but it still, you know, was very much how people chose to believe things. I don't know. It's a tough thing.
Yeah, I would like to think that if children are to get religious upbringing, they should get it at church, but by the same token, a lot of children don't go to church, so they should at least be exposed somehow to these great areas of our cultural heritage.
Would you have any, could you give me a little bit of insight about St. George and the dragon and the story behind that? Was it the Crusades?
Not much.
Not much?
The English like St. George, don't they?
Yeah.
God for Harry, England, and St. George and all of that. My Greek Orthodox friends love St. George. Megalomartis, the great martyr, St. George is, from my Greek Orthodox friends. And they celebrate with great gusto his feast day on April 23rd, I think.
The first day of Taurus.
The first day of Taurus. I think St. George didn't have his legend fully developed until about the 12th century or something. That is to say, he didn't start slaying the dragon until about 1,000 years after he was actually dead, I think.
So what was he a saint for?
He got martyred.
Oh, okay.
Died for the faith.
Oh, okay.
Which is really good enough. I mean, you don't necessarily have to slay a dragon in order to be a great saint.
Although I think the slaying of the dragon is going back to a alchemical principle with the symbol of the Ouroboros, and the snake is always synonymous, or not always, but quite often synonymous with the dragon. And it's this idea of the searching within and perhaps looking at the parts of yourself that are not that attractive. But it's better to do it by searching within than trying to find someone and projecting it outwardly.
Well, it's a polysemous symbol, isn't it, the serpent?
You have to explain that word to me.
It points toward many meanings. You do find the Ouroboros in some of the very most ancient Greek alchemical writings. And the symbol there seems to be more the ebb and flow, but endless ebb and flow of the alchemical process. If I recall one of these early diagrams, the serpent is half white and half black. It brings to mind the alternation back and forth of the alchemical process, to which there is conceivably no end.
And also the symbol of the yin and the yang.
The symbol of the yin and the yang. The serpent, as you well know, takes on rather more sinister connotations in Christian tradition. In some ways, St. George is a figure like St. Michael. St. Michael also slays the dragon of chaos. In the first chapters of the Bible, it says that the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the primordial deep. Well, that deep, Tehom in Hebrew, is similar to the Babylonian Tiamat, the dragon that was there before creation. And other places in the Old Testament, Israel has its own dragon, Rahab, or Leviathan, the sea monster. And these are symbols of chaos, of disorder, that God brings creation out of, draws creation forth from.
Which is a beautiful image. And I think it's the image that we're going to have to end on. I want to thank you so much for being with me here today.
Thanks for having me.
Perhaps we can do it again sometime.
I'd love to.
Okay, this is Mary Michelle for WVIP. Hi, this is Mary Michelle for WVIP, and I'm here today with a friend of mine, someone that is a teacher of the tradition and a student of transformation herself. and we're going to talk about the life, death, and life cycle that is inherent in all the earth-based traditional philosophies, if you would. So I'm here today with Ahs'tiana, and she is someone that has studied particularly the Native American traditions, and we're going to start the conversation with a little bit of that.
Great.
Okay, so we want to come into the ideas of how the elements work within these confines of the Native American and how it correlates with South American traditions and perhaps Celtic traditions, but how the earth really is represented in the philosophies and traditions or religion. What do you think is the difference between religion and tradition?
Well, let's see. Religion and tradition. It seems to me that the traditions of a people have much more to do with their connection with the earth, their connection with time, and their connection with the members of their community, whether it's the animals, the other people, the spirits. So the sense of community is expanded, and tradition is a way of honoring one's relationships with all of the members of one's community. Religion has a very different function.
Maybe we shouldn't get into that.
I know. You just walked right in. I'm going to start dissing religion. I've been up 2 minutes.
No. We have an idea about the nature of religion, and we believe that religion has validity and so on. But we have also this idea that the earth is something that's terribly important, and that the beginnings of most traditions or religions or whatever are based in some of these concepts, like the elements. Should we go straight into the Celtic Native American idea of the 4 elements?
In Celtic tradition and legend, on the 31st, or the evening between the 31 of October and the 1 of November. Now, the 31 is known as Samhain or Samhain, depending on how you pronounce it. Celtic, Samhain, Samhain, okay. So between the 31 and the 1 is an evening where it was understood that the veils between the 2 worlds were very thin.
And this is where the masks come in. Veils, masks.
Right. Well, the veils are symbolically represented by the wearing of a mask. Because the veil between the physical and the spiritual worlds are seen to be thin, then it allows more influence from the spiritual side to bubble forth or bleed through into the physical side. And so the way that was celebrated or honored is by the wearing of a mask. Also, sometimes the wearing of a mask was a representation of an ancestor spirit or an animal spirit or a dream that someone had or something that they were working with archetypally or psychologically, a manifestation of energy that was very close to them. Because this time of the year was seen as the end of the agricultural year, the end of harvest, and then the transition point where there was the beginning of a new year, a growth cycle beginning after a period of dormancy, okay? But going back to the point, this is a time of the year that there's an ending, a death. Okay, the earth is fallow, harvest has been completed. And again, we're using the Celtic initially because in their agricultural cycle, this time of the year is when things literally are cooling down.
Where they are geographically.
Yes.
It has to do with geography,
right.
Although you can correlate some of these ideas according to the same times of the year. In different, certainly if it's north of the equator or south of the equator. But one of the interesting things that we had talked about was the power of being on the equator and the cultures that developed that were around the equator. The pyramids and both in the Mayan cultures and in Egypt, and of course in